Okay, so we spend a lesson or two on some new grammar or vocabulary, and we're pleased that our students seem to get it. But when we move on, you notice that they're not using it in their speaking or writing. And I think this is something that's a particular issue with higher levels who already have enough language to be understood. So they don't feel they need this new language necessarily. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. This is something that I've come across a few times actually in my classroom.
I'm Abby.
I'm Charlotte, and you're listening to a My World of ELT podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about our own experiences of encouraging students to use new language in their day-to-day English.
Okay, so Charlotte, in your experience, why do you think students avoid using new language, even if it's clear that they understand it?
I think there are perhaps a few reasons. I think sometimes perhaps students see it as a bit more of an academic exercise, like, oh, well, I've learnt it now, I know this, I've ticked that box, and then it's like, so what are we doing next? And perhaps there's not really that connection between what they've learned and what they're using in the real world. So I think there's that sort of disconnection there. What about you?
Yeah, I get what you're saying about the checklist. It's, ticking something off and going, yep, studied that, studied that, studied that. And I think it is almost seen as, when you look at, if you're working from a course book, you look at a course book and it is just a list of things that need to be done rather than things that you're going to incorporate into your language production. So I think there's definitely an element of that. Students not really thinking about the day-to-day relevance of it. It's just something to study. It's an academic subject, as you say.
And sometimes as well, with that course book mentality, it's almost like, right, well, we've done that unit, we've finished that chapter. What's coming up in the tests? Because I need to know it for like the end of course test or the end of week test. And okay, yep, I've done that now. So yeah, what's next?
That's a really good point. I think for those students that are going to be sitting some kind of exam of any description, whether that's, IELTS or whether it's a Cambridge exam or whatever it is, it's hard to get away from that mentality of, well, I'm learning this to do well in the exam. And so it is a case of getting through everything they need to get through rather than thinking about, oh, now I've learned this. I wonder how I could actually put it into practice. It's really tricky, isn't it, to avoid that, because you can understand why they're anxious about making sure they've understood what they need to do in the test and they're not really thinking beyond that.
Definitely.
So what levels in particular do you notice this happening with?
Well, I think as you mentioned in the introduction, it does tend to be the higher levels. So perhaps from kind of like intermediate and up. And I think, if you've got to intermediate level or higher, you're doing well, you're probably getting by, you can probably do everything you need to do in the outside world, or you can communicate with people, and even if you find it a bit tricky sometimes, you'll find a way to do whatever it is you want to do. So I think perhaps sometimes with the higher levels there's sort of less incentive to try and incorporate any kind of new language or new grammar, because it's kind of like, well, I don't really need to. Whereas if you're at a lower level, you're elementary, you're pre-intermediate or working your way to intermediate, you might really need that vocabulary, or you might need that grammar structure just to actually do something in the real world, or to get by, or to have that conversation. So perhaps there's less, you've got less to choose from in your English bank.
I remember that in my own language learning, actually, that in those early days, everything you're learning is a game changer. It's like, oh, wow, now I can say this, now I can say that. I've got the tools to be able to communicate that. And then you get to a level where it's about actually making choices about how you communicate. You could do it like this, you could use this word or this phrase. And I think as soon as you end up in a lucky enough position to have choices, then maybe you end up getting comfortable with the things and you stick to those and you don't challenge yourself. So I can kind of relate to that myself, to be honest, as a language learner.
Me too, for sure.
So Charlotte, do you think students are aware that they're avoiding this new language, or is it something that's just happening subconsciously?
I think this is a really tricky question because, to be honest, it's not actually a conversation that I've had with any of my students.
Mm.
But I think that they're not necessarily aware. I think it does come back to that necessity. It's kind of like, if I need it, then maybe I'll try and use it. Or also that thinking about, that motivation for learning, like, why have I learned this? Why have I been going to class this week? Is it because I've got a test on Friday or Monday? So if so, I'll try and remember it and use it for that. So I think it can come back to your motivation for learning. Is it because I want to communicate in a certain situation? Is it because I'm on an exam course and I'm going to need this structure for my writing because I've been told I need to use a variety of structures? Do I need this vocab to show a bit of range in my answers? So I think that they're not necessarily aware that they're not using it, but perhaps they're more aware of when they've learnt something that they want to use or that they need to use. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, you make a good point, actually, because I think possibly looking back over some of my teaching over the years, the most effective way of getting students to use it is if there is that need. So like that exam situation you were talking about, where they've been told, what's going to get you a good grade, or what's going to get you a good score, is if you can demonstrate this, demonstrate that. And
Yeah.
so there's that really proactive attitude to putting it into practice, because this will get me the score I need, or this will get me the grade. But I guess if people are learning a language just for day-to-day living, there's not that same pressure. There's not that same external expectation to use new language. So perhaps that's a situation where they just, like we were saying, they stick within their comfort zone and they use the phrases they already know, and nobody's going to tell them off for not using any new phrases, because they're literally learning the language just to get by and go to the shops and get public transport and do some online bookings. So no one's questioning the language they're not using. Whereas in an exam, they are. In an exam, it's a case of, oh, I didn't see any evidence of this or any evidence of knowledge of that particular grammar.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think another classic case of students not being aware of the language they're not using is, I don't know, have you been in that present perfect classroom where you've taught the present perfect? You've put an example on the board, they've done an activity, they've done it all really well. I have eaten, I have gone, I have traveled. And they do this activity and they stick their hand up and say, "Teacher, I've finished." And you're
Oh, the
thinking,
classic.
and you're thinking, that's the perfect opportunity to use the present perfect. Why didn't they use it? Why,
Yeah.
I can't believe they've got 10 out of 10 on this grammar activity, and then they've completely missed this amazing opportunity to use it in an authentic situation. And I think that's a classic example of them not making that connection, as you were saying, between a thing that's being studied academically and its real world use. I think that can quite often get overlooked or misunderstood.
So, Abby, what solutions have you come up with for dealing with this?
I think that it's really important to recognise that our role as a teacher is to not just convey this new language, not just make sure they understand what it means and what it looks like, but actually to help them to understand where and when it's used. Because if they don't understand the real world purpose of this language, then it's all for nothing, really. If they can't take it off the page and apply it, then I think they need a lot of guidance. We can't just assume that because they've studied something theoretically, they can take that leap to using it autonomously in their day to day. So contextualization is really key to this. I think not just telling them, now we've studied this is where you might use it, but actually teaching it in that context and saying, right, imagine this situation. You're in your classroom, you're doing an activity, you've finished the activity, and you want your teacher to know, what would we say? So going back to that scenario of, why do students say I finished instead of I have finished? Introducing it in that context and saying, do you know what we would say in this situation when something just happened? We'd say, I have finished, I've finished. And I think then they don't have to join the dots. They don't have to learn the language and go, okay, great. When do I use this? Because we've been really explicit in that right from the start. What about you?
I think that's a perfect example that you've given there. I think contextualization is so important. It's something that we talk about a lot on our courses and our teacher training courses, and actually encouraging your students, again, going back to what we were saying, of not just seeing this as an academic exercise, but what kind of context can I use this in my world of everyday English? And that's sort of part of our job as well. It's not just about, like you said, the form. How does it look? Can we put it into a sentence? Can we do this gap fill? It's kind of like, okay, and now can we use it in a conversation? So I think that encouragement is really, really important.
Definitely.
And Abby, do you think it's a good idea to try and make students more autonomous in their use of new language?
I really do. I think there's only so much we can do within the four walls of our classroom, if you like. Once they leave that classroom and they're on their own, they need to have the confidence to try this new language without somebody there encouraging them and telling them, go on, you can do it, have a go, well done. So we need to do that in our classroom. We need to encourage and build their confidence in that safe environment. But we also need to make sure we're giving them the tools and the skills to self-regulate, if you like, leave the classroom and evaluate, oh, that thing that I said, could I have said that differently? Is there any language I could have used there that I was avoiding or I didn't think to use? So I think any opportunity for reflection and, for example, in the classroom after a speaking activity, saying, right, instead of starting by me giving you feedback on how you did, you have a think about how you did. So think about things like the range of vocabulary, the range of grammar. Did you play it safe or did you try some new stuff that we've learned recently? Getting them to think in that way is something they can then carry through into their use of English outside of the classroom. And that's so important to make that transition. Otherwise, it becomes something that is kind of limited to, the classroom environment. And that's not the point. The whole point of language learning is to take it outside of that space.
Yeah.
So the more we can do to get them, being aware of what they're saying, thinking about how it could be better, but at the same time, congratulating themselves on new things they've tried, then I think the more likely they are to give it a go and continue that progression in their own time outside of lessons. What about you?
I completely agree with you, what you were just saying about reflection. And I think, again, this is something that as teachers, it's a skill that we might have to teach our students because, there are a lot of cultures, a lot of countries where that might not be something that students have been encouraged to do previously. But it is so important, rather than always looking to the teacher to say, you should use this, you did it right, that wasn't quite right, do this, do that. So instead of always looking to the teacher, learning to reflect and learning to ask yourself those questions that you were saying, could I have done something differently? What have I used? Was that right? And learning to rely on yourself a little bit more and learning that skill. And as teachers, I think we really need to encourage that skill so that when you're not in the classroom, you're not relying on anybody to be that kind of crutch. You're sort of learning to rely on yourself and becoming more confident in your own convictions.
That's so true. And I think as a teacher, it can feed your ego to have a classroom of people that rely on you. Like, teacher, was that right? Was that okay? Give me feedback. But
sure.
that's only helpful there and then. And that's such a small proportion of, where their English is going to be used in that classroom space. So yeah, I couldn't agree more that I think it is about, rely on me a little bit less. I'll guide you, I'll support you, I'll point you in the right direction, but ultimately, you need to be able to do this on your own.
Like having children.
Yeah, exactly.
In the end of the day, you do want them to be independent.
And fly the nest.
Yes.
So, Charlotte, what tips would you give to teachers who are experiencing this in their own classrooms?
Well, I would say one thing that can be really helpful is to provide some positive incentives for using new language. For some students, that might be having some kind of award or some sort of recognition, like perhaps a student of the week, giving that little recognition to a student who's really tried hard, who's really worked at using the new language in different contexts, or done a bit of reflective practice that we were talking about in the last section.
Nice.
And I think it's really important, again, as teachers, for us to recognise and praise the use of new language. So keep those ears open so that when we hear our students say it or we see it in a piece of writing, that they've done it themselves. It's not something that we've told them they have to do. It's just happened, that we recognise that and we praise it, because that can be just so motivating. And I think also there are times when we should be sort of questioning our students to get them to think about different ways of saying something. So they might have produced a really great piece of writing. It might be grammatically correct and it might be, a really nice piece of writing. But we might also want to say to them, is there any way you could make this better? Is there a better structure you could use here? What is it? Is it something we've studied recently? So it's, again, really encouraging your students to reflect on what they've done and think, is there a different way? Is there a better way? Is there anything you could add there, Abby?
When you were saying about praise and recognition, that can have a really positive knock-on effect to the other students in the class. So if they see one student getting praised for using a new word that they learned recently, that might get them thinking, oh, maybe I could use a new word. Let me have a think about something I could use. So that can have a really good knock-on effect on the rest of the class if they see that there is a case for positive recognition of new language.
Agreed. So Abby, what about advice that you give to your trainee teachers in this situation?
So an interesting learning journey, I think, for our trainee teachers is that when they come to plan their lessons, they're told how to structure a lesson so that they start by introducing some new language. They get their learners to do some very controlled practice tasks to demonstrate they understand this new language. And then they progress their learners to some kind of freer activity. And I think a lot of the issues that trainee teachers have when they get to that freer stage is they come up with some really nice creative activities where students can speak more freely or write more freely. And then they just don't use the target language that they've taught them. It's so free that, all their creativity is going into these lovely ideas. And there are zero examples of the language they've just been teaching them. So with our trainee teachers in that situation, it's making them aware that although we want our students to use the language more freely, there still has to be a structure and a framework that encourages them to focus on this new language that you want them to use. So any kind of, instructions like, write something free, pick your own example that you want to build on, develop your ideas. But I want to see at least 5 examples of this structure, or I want to see at least 6 new words that we've looked at this week. So there's that misconception that free means do what you like, and then students avoid anything new they're not very confident with. We need to go, no, there is freedom in this task, but there are still expectations for you to learn some of this new language.
I think that's a great point you've made there about free practice tasks. And I think the other thing that is a great tip for our trainee teachers is to give your students thinking time before a speaking activity to get them to specifically focus on how they could integrate the new language, so that, like you said in your instructions, you might want to say, I want to see at least 5 examples of this. So then you just give them that little bit of thinking time to kind of work out how they're going to incorporate it. And like you said, it's still a free task. They can still bring in lots of other language. They still have freedom within it, but they've really got a great opportunity to produce that new language, whether it's vocabulary or whether it's a new grammatical structure.
Yeah, that thinking time is so important, because without it, they're just going to revert to what they know, aren't they? It takes time to have that confidence and to process, all of that new stuff that you want to bring in.
Definitely.
If you'd like some tips on how to encourage students to use new language outside of the classroom, click on the link for our free downloadable pointers on how teaching language in context can help.
And did you know that we also have a language module on this topic? Go to our website to check out our bite-sized language modules, focusing on practical classroom phrases and teaching tips on a range of topics.
Thanks for listening to this My World of ELT podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.